Oh, we could talk about.
Oh, we're live.
All right. Hey, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. Hi, Josh. How are you doing?
I am doing good, Lisa. How are you doing?
Pretty good for a Monday evening.
I hear you. It's a Monday.
That it is. So we're talking about secret spaces tonight.
Yes, I like secret spaces.
Well, always a mystery. And we do have to thank a listener for suggesting this topic. So thank you, Janice, for asking about it. And hopefully you get to see this and enjoy what we have to say.
And
go ahead.
Oh, I was just agreeing. Absolutely.
Well, I think, the Ozarks actually have several different kinds of secret spaces.
Oh, they do. They do. Mining.
Mining, yeah. Why don't we talk about mines a little bit, because we haven't really touched on that too much.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. And what is particularly interesting, I think interesting in two factors with mining is, first of all, you guys, you up here in the Joplin area are in the epicenter of Ozarks mining district.
Yeah, the Tri-State Mining District. It was the largest lead zinc mining district in the world.
And with that, of course, amazing stories. And I think many people don't necessarily realize that mining district exists, or if they do know, if they're familiar with the mining district existing, they might not realize that it is indeed in the Ozarks.
That's true. And it actually was a fairly large area. Went down into Oklahoma, down around Miami and Pitcher, and also through a lot of Southwest Missouri, up through Joplin, Carthage, down to Granby, and on east. And then there was actually a separate lead and zinc district on the eastern side of the Ozarks in southeast Missouri.
Yes, absolutely. And that's getting over there by Farmington.
Yeah, and that started a little earlier, but the one over here became very important militarily in the Civil War. The mines were fought over because basically whoever controlled the lead mines here controlled munitions for the Western Theater. And
yes,
that continued until after World War II. This area actually supplied most of the bullets for the United States in World War I and World War II. So.
And you think about that, and of course, this is kind of jumping off in terms of those secret spaces, but Merrimack is of course, you got your iron ore mines that was predating the Civil War. That was, and you think about that. First of all, you think about, and we talked about river lore and river ghosts and that sort of thing. And over there on the river, if you look at it, the Union's great armored gunboat fleets, the sort of the first generation of armored ships, things like the Carondelet, that fought in the Western Theater, that fought the great battles on the Mississippi, that laid siege to Vicksburg. These types of boats, we can't call them ships. They're on the river. So even though they're very large, they're called boats, and they were made from iron. They were sheathed in iron that was mined at Merrimack. And so many of the dark the dark history of the Ozarks that resulted in guerrilla warfare, that resulted in civilian casualties, that so many things that happened in the Ozarks took place because Lincoln, with his war cabinet, looked at the situation and said, we cannot lose Missouri, and hence making Missouri so sought after and so fought over during the war.
That's very true, and most people don't really think about it, but Missouri had the third largest number of battles in the Civil War. Only Virginia and Tennessee had more, and a lot of it had to do with those resources and controlling the military roads, because it was a big factor in who was going to win or lose. But then you have the separate issues of just those dark spaces, and so many men died in horrific accidents over time. Lore would grow up about whether or not even they were haunted, or I've heard tales of ghost miners and ghost, wagons pulled by horses out of the mines, that kind of thing. And they became almost a taboo area to avoid, not only just for danger, but for some of that secretiveness that went along with them. And then later on, at least in this part of the country, as we get into the Depression era particularly, some of them became prime locations to dump cars and bodies, because some of the mines were alkaline, so the evidence would be dissolved before long.
Yeah. Oh, which is pretty doggone creepy all the way around.
Yes. I don't think it gets much more creepier than that. Just dump the body in the mine so it dissolves.
Yeah. And and I think about this, and I've got memories of going out to old abandoned homesteads, covered up with grass and fallen in and snakes around, and realizing that somewhere on the property even is just an abandoned well, and it's just that conceptually that there is a literal underworld, and it is dangerous.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of amusing for locals around here, because they've reclaimed so much of the mining land, and they've built new homes, subdivisions on part of it. And so often you will see these, and locals would be like, I'm not buying a house in there, because it's a matter of time till there'll be sinkholes. And so a lot of the people who buy are actually coming in from other areas and have no idea what was there before. I grew up with, we call them tap piles, those tailings from the mines, and some of them would be, hundreds of feet tall, and just acre after acre after acre. People would go exploring, biking, etc., four-wheeling, etc. But you had to be careful, because you never knew if it was going to shift and a shaft would open up. And those are all gone. So unless you have those memories, you don't really know where those dangers are, which kind of adds to that secretiveness.
It does, and I think it also speaks to culturally something that takes place that we see over and over, which is natives. And the natives could even just have been there for a couple of generations, but people who for whatever reason have earned their past,
right,
as opposed to the newcomers and the people who come in. And and you see that. I think that there's I don't know if it would be the same thing in other regions. I think America, because we are so young as a nation, that there's a certain amount of uneasiness in our zeitgeist. I think that would be the way to put it. The sense that whether we consciously know it, that we unconsciously understand that comparatively speaking, we're the newcomers, and that there are other things, and that that we sometimes those other things aren't known, and that it comes with that it comes with a certain amount of risk attached to it. And I think, just as an example of where I think that zeitgeist really rose to the surface, is with the 1980s film Poltergeist, of building the new suburban home on top of the Native American cemetery, with disaster ensuing.
Yes. And that certainly happened in a lot of places here and all over America, actually. So it was not common to just build on top of cemeteries. In fact, just move the tombstones.
Yeah, which is unsettling.
Yeah. Someone asked about over Indian burial grounds. No, it's never good. Not even cemeteries. There's a 40-acre cemetery not far from here that they moved the tombstones, and you can. There's businesses, there's new homes, there's apartment complexes on it, and there's spaces where you can just see the uniform dips in the ground. You can see where the graves are, and they were never moved. And there's actually a lot of ghost tales that come out of that area, and a lot of people who live there don't even know it was a cemetery.
Do you think, this is kind of going down the poltergeist hole, but do you think that there is a risk to doing that? I mean, obviously it's disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's
generally my experience is most cemeteries aren't haunted, but I think that there can be something that unsettles things, and it's almost like something walking between the veil, this and the other side, between this and the other side, that once you remove the tombstones and things are disturbed, but the bodies are not reinterred, there does seem to be a correlation with those spaces having things happen. But cemeteries generally not so much. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the act of almost purposely forgetting and not passing that on. And I think that kind of leads in a little bit to what we were talking about before we went live about the Tommyknockers. Yes.
Oh, and I love that lore. Of course, it's predominantly Welsh. Again, the Welsh have a literal history of the copper and tin mines going back to before the Romans. Mm-hmm. And I pulled this great quote from a documentary, a Celtic mythology documentary, that in reference to the Tommyknockers, and of course beginning this, said, I heard my grandfather on my mother's side say, when he was working at the mudwork pit in Timor, there were some men who swore they could hear work going on ahead of them. And of course, this is down in the mine. The sound of people working way ahead of them. And they knew it was impossible because the mine was, of course, very deep, but was also out under the sea. So there couldn't be any other workers nearby. Because they were so insistent, because the workers were so insistent and obviously worried, the pit official asked my grandfather, who was a maintenance man, to go underground with him the following Sunday to see if they could hear anything. They went through the whole mine and heard nothing. But, he told me, the ones who heard the noise all died in a pit explosion. And my grandfather survived the blast. And of course, it's not my grandfather. This was pulled from this documentary, and it came along with the quote, and I love the quote, that the Celtic perspective is one that from the cradle to the grave, we have a sense of being shadowed by beings not quite of this world. And I think that's accurate. I think in most cases where there's some sort of paranormal activity, that is the case. I mean, it's something that's in between, and you either accept it or you don't. But yeah, it seems to be a common thread with more secret places and forgetting the past. Yes. Yeah. Both of which can come with peril.
Yes. And it's almost as if the Tommyknockers are there to remind you of the past in some ways.
Mm-hmm. And I think, this seems to be a resonant theme across the board, that whether it's intended or not, that our interaction with the paranormal or our interaction with the supernatural in these regards is that we're meant to learn something from it. And it's not a tidy, fable, but we are meant to learn something. We're meant to shift our perspective a bit in a way that, for example, might make us more respectful or might make us listen better. But it is traditionally subtle. It's not, I think the concept of the woods are evil, don't go in the woods, it is a little, it's painting the concept with a heavy brush. I think there's there are nuanced layers to these tales and to these ideas that I believe make us better people if we are willing to take the time to unlayer or unravel them.
I think so. And it reminds me of a particular incident that I investigated. It was actually in southeast Kansas, just over the state line, at an old coal mine. And most of the coal mines there were strip mines, but in the very beginning, they did do underground mining. And there was an old underground mine on the property. Interestingly, there was also activity of Indian spirits, particularly Iwa. And Iwa are sort of almost a hybrid type phenomenon that the natives believe they're spirit, but yet they have physical presence as well. And some often view them as malevolent or at least tricksters. And so you had both of these things going on, and then activities centered on a teenage boy. But there were multiple witnesses saying that they would see phantom miners and mules coming out of the old mine entrance. But there was no indication there to there being an accident or an explosion or death in the mine. So it again was subtle.
Yeah.
And it was as if almost it seemed as if the miners and the Indian spirits were seeking a balance of territorial presence, almost, is the sense you got.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. But that's the only way I can describe it.
Yeah. So during the investigation, what can you talk about?
I'm not going to go into a lot of details just for privacy, but basically, the miners would be visible to multiple people at times, the Iwa to a few, and ceremonial dances would be heard. Presumed were ceremonial dances, and all in a very small space. And like I said, it's almost like a standoff between the two. And and I think that happens a lot when you enter into something new in an area. There's a push sometimes from the older to maintain a balance that we tend to just gloss over in our digital society, but it is there almost as a reminder.
It is, and the concepts of balance are something that we see as a recurring theme in many different quote unquote primitive cultures. And I put them in quotes because I think that our ancient peoples oftentimes were more sophisticated and in many cases wise in things that we scarcely understand than we are.
I agree with you there. let's shift a little bit to the other secret places. Hollows.
Yes, hills and well, not so much the hills, the hollers,
Yes.
and the coves. Of course, regular viewers will be accustomed to the fact I reference this book a lot, but the authors did a great job, and they have a glossary in the back, a very interesting glossary. And I thought this was cool because a cove, which you see the term cove really used in reference to water.
Shoreline. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, shoreline, or oftentimes in Appalachia, but it means the same thing in Appalachia as it does in the Ozarks, which is specifically a narrow, steep-walled valley with a spring or waterfall at the head, which usually falls swiftly to a larger valley at the cove mouth. And of course, I think probably the most famous Appalachian Cove is probably Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains. But we've got a lot of coves in the Ozarks. Typically, when you get into the much more rough or rugged regions, and you start shifting away, there's because the Ozarks are not a raised mountain chain; they're a mountain plateau that has been slowly weathered down. So if you're coming from the north into the Ozarks, you don't go up into the mountains, you go down into the mountains. And along the way, of course, getting there, coming through Springfield, coming out of the prairie, you just start seeing more exposed rock, but there's still a lot of plateaus. There's a lot of what was traditionally grassland.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really until you get into some really rugged country, some of that, of course, is the Boston Mountains in Arkansas, that you start getting into those deep spaces where you do literally have coves hidden in the mountains.
Mm-hmm. And again, access makes it more secretive,
Very much.
And in the early days, a harsher existence.
Yes, it is.
And to hide if you're needing to hide.
Yeah.
we did have something. We had someone comment about when we were talking about the Tommyknockers and everything, about a clash of parallel worlds. Almost.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair.
I think that is a good analogy.
And it's something that, and of course, I reference Celtic mythology a lot because I think it is apropos because of the fact that so many those of Celtic ancestry also settled in the Ozarks.
Mm-hmm.
And something that took place within the Celtic mythology was the idea that a war had at one time raged between the powerful human forces and the old gods, which later became known as the fairy folk, the Tuatha De Danann. And at the end of the war, the truce was that the Tuatha De Danann and the mortals would divide the realm. And you think, okay, they would divide the realm, and our excessively linear human minds think, here's the land, here's your half, here's your half. And I love the Irish or the Welsh, that Celtic mindset that said, no, we're not dividing it like this. We're dividing it like this. Mm-hmm. Humans are on the top. The Tuatha De Danann go beneath, right. And that their realm is beneath the Burrows, beneath the sea.
And that's why the stories of fairy folk and other otherworldly creatures often are in these kind of spaces and coves and hollers and caves and so forth.
It is, and I think that there's, and we talked about water, of course, being very powerful. The potential of limestone and that quartz crystal being very powerful. There's a lot of deeply elemental processes that have to be taken into consideration once you go into that space.
It is a bit of a different world.
It is, and I would, anybody who has not experienced that, I would encourage them to expose themselves to that. And it feels different. I talked about Turner Spring the last time we were on. These Ozark Springs, no amount of scientific understanding of the of hydrology, of geology, of the process of the spring can take away the magic. There is an energy in those spaces that you do not have elsewhere.
Oh, I agree. And then I think it's interesting too that there's so many tales in the Ozarks of murder, of revenge, of chaos happening in those spaces as well.
Yes, and you deal with a couple of things that it reminds me of. One is we talked about sinkholes, but large naturally occurring sinkholes in karst limestone. That's, you think about it, can be downright terrifying.
Yes.
I don't really want to contemplate over the course of the last 300 years how many people who never got found because somebody threw them down a sinkhole.
Exactly. Or went exploring and didn't find their way out.
And did not, or got drunk and didn't find their way out, which we've got a story on that for maybe later. And an area that I'm very, very interested in, if anybody watching has stories that they are up for telling, I would be very interested in doing some more research, and that is the sunk lands over on the Current River, over north of Eminence. And I have been to the sunk lands once, and it's a marsh area in amongst the karst limestone hills. But it's, there's some interesting stories about that. One of the stories is that your compass stops working after you get down in the sunk lands. So if anybody has any tales of that, and that's also over by Devil's Well.
Yes. And I think that it creates emotion for people when you're in spaces like that, because the energies, you may not be real conscious of it, but subconsciously, I think those places where energies do odd things like throw compasses off affect us that we may not overtly be aware of.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And and a little closer to home in terms of secret or underground spaces, underground Eureka Springs, there's a whole block of Eureka Springs that is underneath the street.
Well, and that occurred in other places too. That's the case in Carthage, Missouri too, and Greenfield, Missouri, and so and it ended up for being prime real estate for thievery, for moonshiners, and so on and so forth.
And a lot of prohibition.
Not to mention being favorite hideouts, all these spaces of Old West outlaws like the James Brothers and so forth. And down in McDonald County, Missouri, there's a Thieves Hollow, and it was named that because horse thieves basically controlled it in the 1860s and 70s, and they would steal horses from around, even down into Arkansas, and then they would take them up to Chicago to sell them. And so you still have that, it still retains that name, though a lot of people anymore don't know why it's called that.
Right.
But
I think one of the short realities is the Ozarks can be a great place to hide.
Well, yeah. Well, and it was for a lot of outlaws from the early 1800s through the Depression.
Mhm.
And probably
Yeah,
after that, that if we really wanted to get picky.
this is true. This is true. And and that doesn't even get into the the, like, for example, the underground spaces in Springfield, um,
Yeah.
which are spooky to say the least.
Yes.
What do you think? As we were chatting, off record, I mentioned that oftentimes I will put on, if I have insomnia, I'll put on Ed and Lorraine Warren interviews, and then and I find them very fascinating, but then also they put me to sleep. So I don't know what, like, full public disclosure, I don't know what it says about my psyche that I'm like listening to them share about their demonic exorcism, and I'm like using this as to fall asleep by. But um they talked about the fact that occurrences tend to happen in the low places, in the dark places of homes, or the idea that ghosts are more active at night, these types of things. What do you think about that?
Um, I'm not so sure that they're more active at night. I think we tend to pay more attention to things at night because we're not as distracted by our daily activities and other noise, that now TV or radio or traffic. So a lot of times, a noise will catch our attention more at night because it's breaking the silence. But
Yes.
but as far as the dark recesses of the home, I think there is something to that. My experience is often, as you're investigating, whatever seems to be there will recede to an area where people aren't, and as you go find it, it will move. And so uh, often it does seem to be centered in areas that doesn't have a lot of foot traffic.
Hmm.
It's a
That makes
space for itself. That's not too unusual, in my experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. That does make sense.
Yeah,
And
it's
it
sort of like, I'm doing my thing over here, you do your thing over there.
and do you think, I'm going off, I'm just on a topic, but
Sure.
do you think that the lunar phases impact supernatural activity?
Oh, maybe. I haven't noticed that quite as much as it affecting living activity. My experience as an attorney is that you do notice an uptick in odd things happening crime wise, and people deciding to sue someone immediately after a full moon. But I haven't necessarily seen the same correlation with supernatural activity, but it's possible. We just lost Josh.
Hello.
There you are.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not so sure. I'm not. There may be, but I haven't noticed it per se.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. Or maybe as we as mortals go crazy, we become more sensitive to what's there all the time.
Well, I think that is. I think that can happen. On the flip side, I think though that certain things can create an uptick in activity.
Mm,
The Joplin tornado that happened in 2011, for instance,
yes.
we had a rather large spike in activity and requests for help for about 2 years afterwards in the
Mhm.
area, in the tornado zone area, and also among first responders that didn't necessarily live in the zone, but that worked it. They
Wow.
started having people starting to have activity in their homes. And I just kind of think that when you have that much energy release,
Hmm.
it has an effect on the environment, and either created more activity or amplify, so that we noticed it more.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, if anybody's not familiar with it, the May 2011 Joplin tornado was devastating.
Yes, yes. I mean, it took out over 9,000 structures.
Yeah.
And and having lived here, well, other than being away for a number of years, but I grew up here and then have lived here again another 20 years, that the only thing I can compare it to is the film footage of bombed out cities in Europe in World War II.
Mhm.
And the devastation was so complete that you could see the tall structures on the other side of town, 5 miles away, because suddenly there wasn't anything blocking it. And you could be driving, and signposts, everything was ripped out of the ground. So it was easy to literally forget what intersection you were at, even though you'd lived here your entire life, because there were absolutely no landmarks in a
Yeah.
good chunk of the city. And
Mhm.
when you have that kind of energy, well, to give an idea, it knocked St. John's Hospital off of its foundation 5 inches. And this is a 9-story building that had a footprint of over 2 or 3 acres.
Yeah, yeah,
So, and I just think that when you stir up that much energy, there's a correlating opposite reaction in what happens in this experience.
I agree, and of course that's an impossible to duplicate occurrence, and not one that we would want to. Something that you mentioned in your book that I've consistently found fascinating was the butterfly people.
Oh, yes. That was a phenomenon that kind of caught a lot of people, but as children, they were children who would report this, dozens of reports as they were found by first responders or went to hospitals. They described what they called the butterfly people being with them, or the group of people they were with. And I found it interesting that not one of them described them as an angel. They were all described as butterfly people. And they would describe them as a being of light, taller than a regular person, but with butterfly wings. And they consistently describe them as like holding the people down, keeping debris off of them, and basically watching over them. And it was such a uniform characterization. And there was no time or way for them to hear it from other people. These were all independent, on the spot descriptions that were virtually identical.
Mm-hmm.
And so something was going on. And interesting, the flip side of that is that in the aftermath, there were a number of reports of people seeing shadow figures, and typically they would describe them as hooded shadow figures that would be walking along with survivors down the street or whatever, and almost as if they were guiding them. But none of it was described as being negative or fearful or anything like that. But almost a Grim Reaper type shadow figure without the scythe, and basically escorting the survivors. And so you had this light being and this shadow being, one after the other, being seen. And again, immediate candid descriptions. So it wasn't like they came out, days or weeks later after it had been reported.
And I think it's something, as just as an example, with the cover of this book has a scary werewolf on the front, I don't know who did the art. I could look it up, but and interestingly enough, there's no stories of wolf people in the book. But we oftentimes associate paranormal activity with something that is negative, almost consistently with the aforementioned Ed and Lorraine Warren. It's all demonic, not all of it, but so much, activity that has to be exercised and that sort of thing. But in many cases, we're dealing with entity or energy that is either is neutral, or in some cases is actually positive.
Yes, I think to be honest, I think our concept of a guardian angel is wrapped up in some of these experiences, and that certainly is with the butterfly people, although none of these children describe them as angels, which you would expect at least some would, with religion and churches being as strong as they are in the area.
Yes.
And so
yes.
The fact that they were not thinking of angels, that they really saw them as something different than maybe that they had in Sunday school, I find very interesting.
I agree, and it's and to be clear, we are definitely in the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Yes,
it is Christian faith is an integral part of the Ozarks culture, and has been for generations. And so again, I concur the fact that with these very specific accounts were coming in that were positive. To me, it's beautiful. It gives me chills, but and it's funny for people who are just listening in. I read about this account from Lisa's book and then messaged Lisa and was like, okay, tell me more about the butterfly people.
Well, and now and there are murals on buildings with the butterflies, and there are other art installations highlighting butterflies around town now, and none of it says the story. They're just there. So if you aren't aware of the story of the butterfly people, you may just wonder why are all these butterflies in Joplin? We're not exactly, on the migration path of the monarch or something, but there's a reason that's there. And I have to wonder, in 30, 40 years, are people going to be wondering, why do we have all these butterflies?
Mm-hmm. Very, very true. And I think, something that we touched on earlier at times, something associated with both of the old Irish stories of the fairies taking you, and then the UFO abduction theories and that sort of thing. The idea that and maybe it is a parallel world, maybe it is a dimensional shift, that something may occur that the human mind simply cannot comprehend, and there's certain ways in which the mind makes sense of things. Mm-hmm. And those as a possibility. You think about the casualty count, you think about the energy release, you think about the mass in all near instantaneous devastation that occurred with that particular storm, and you can't help but think something clearly happened.
Yes, I mean, if in sci-fi you might talk about a rip in time or something, but is something like that, could it literally become almost a tear in the veil?
Mm-hmm.
Enough energy release. Scientifically you can't say that, but you have to wonder with people's encounters.
You do. You really, really do. It is intriguing. I think a lot of people shy away from the idea because, just like we said, there aren't easy answers. We like things that are neat and tidy, and at the end of the day, we've wrapped up the story, and y'all can go to bed knowing that we've wrapped up the story and everything is back in its box. It's kind of like the idea that you can take all of the toys out of the toy box as long as you promise to put them all back in the box before you go to bed. And when you dig into these elements, it really is a disservice to the subject matter to say there's a neat, tidy explanation. Let's put it all back and go back to our regular world.
Well, that's right. And then it stretches your perspective as well. And that's not always a comfortable thing.
Stretching can be very uncomfortable.
Whether it's perspective or physically, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. For anybody that, take a yin class, take a yoga yin class. We're gonna hold this pose for 5 minutes for deep breathing. And I think it's the same. I think it's the same. There is discomfort in improvement, and there is discomfort in change, and there is discomfort in growth. And human beings do not like discomfort. I'm leading the way on that.
Yeah, that's very true. And then when you're talking about physical spaces, you're often talking about either very mysterious places or very beautiful places, and they often get intertwined with tragedy and violence. And again, it becomes uncomfortable that you have all those things in the same box. And sometimes you can't explain why some of those things happen, whether it's supernatural or man's actions.
Mm-hmm. It is, and we've both talked, and obviously it's something that you can't quantify, but the sense, the impression that you get from certain spaces. Some spaces, for example, when they like you, that.
Yes.
Some spaces it might shift. My experience at the Crescent has ranged from being unbelievably uncomfortable to incredibly comfortable. And in referencing back to the time frame, I've been in the bowels of the Crescent Hotel after 10 o'clock at night. I've been roaming around on the floors after 11 o'clock at night by myself. It's fine. The one time that I was terrified, it was 2 PM, and in a crowd of people. So you really can't quantify that. I come back to, of course, one of the most fascinating places for me is the murder brothel, the beautiful restored hotel / brothel in Galena, Kansas. But just spending time in that space, and then we walked out, and you said, "What did you feel?" And just that, if I'm honest about it, what I felt was an enormous amount of anger.
Yes.
A lot of anger. It wasn't unlike the anger that I felt at the Crescent Hotel. It wasn't directed at me. It was the sense that the energy, or the individual or the individuals who are angry within this space, they couldn't care less whether or not I existed. It has nothing to do with me. And they seem to be predominantly aware of the fact that it has nothing to do with me. Like I don't care about you. You're over there. What do we care about you for? But they're angry.
Exactly. And that's often an experience there, as well as people will feel that. Then other people will have the sensation of feeling like they're drunk, like they have gone through the experience of many of the guests and would have back in the day. And I had someone once say, are they getting us ready to knock us off or something to that effect? And I said, no, I don't necessarily think so, but you were feeling what certainly some people would have felt there. And it's funny that is a space that definitely has an effect on people. It does,
and it's beautiful.
It is. It's absolutely gorgeous, and they've done a wonderful job restoring it. And but there are things there that I think you're right, that it's like they don't care whether you're there or not. They're having their experience. I sometimes tell people, we don't want to think about it, but the reality is we may be having breakfast with someone we can't see every morning. And they may be aware of us or they may not. It's just
Mhm.
like that. They're there and they don't care whether you're there or not most of the time,
Yeah. And
whether they're
it's,
happy or angry.
yeah. And I think, and this is one of those sobering thoughts, sobering realities that we don't like thinking about. We're constantly referencing the mortal world, the mortal world. The mortal world is the empirical world. It is the physical realm. It is what we know. It is what exists. It is what is. But the human life is so comparatively short that we're the ones, as mortals, who are passing through. We're the shadows.
In many ways. You know, there's a sometimes people will ask, well, why do we see so many when people see apparitions? They're from a long time ago, and I think part of that is because they've been around long enough to figure out how to interact.
Hmm.
But there are times that you do have apparitions that are contemporary or fairly contemporary. But if that energy's been around for 200 years, there's more opportunity to learn to manipulate the environment and the energies around it. And I think that's part of it. And so, yeah, we are a bit of a shadow passing through as living entities.
Hmm. From I'm coming up with all the questions. I'm falling into interview mode. Um, but I always have fun with this. Do you think with where science is headed that we'll get to the point of being able to quantify ghosts?
I think eventually, yes. And a lot of people are a lot smarter than me have thought so. I know Thomas Edison, Tesla, Einstein, they were all of the opinion that as science turned its attention to these subjects, that it would be resolved as a matter of some sort of scientific principles. And my
Mhm.
personal inclinations, I think, has a lot to do with quantum physics.
Okay. And saying that, talking about Edison and Tesla, you go back to the 19th century America, post Civil War, the rise of the Spiritist movement,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of spiritualism, individuals who were, of course, for their time, they were modern, contemporary, industrial age Americans who said, we want answers.
And a lot of that came out of the Civil War because there was so much death and destruction that many turned their attention to wanting communication. And Mary Todd Lincoln was one person who explored that and made it more fashionable to discuss and explore. And then the spiritualist movement continued from there.
Yeah, yeah. And then, for individuals who are experiencing intense grief, it makes sense.
It really does. And it was grief on a scale that, I mean, these were people who were used to death. I mean, it was not uncommon for children to die, women to die in childbirth, all kinds of accidents, or smallpox, TB, etc. But the Civil War created death even on a scale they weren't used to.
Yes, yes.
And
And I think the heartbreaking part was death on a scale they weren't used to, with a demographic who traditionally weren't supposed to die.
yes, yes, a lost generation of young men predominantly.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
suddenly what you could count on, you thought you couldn't count on. And it's in those moments that people tend to explore the esoteric.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I think it's where we oftentimes discount things like, the poetry and art and these things as extracurricular activities. We call them hobbies. We put them off to the side. And that's where I feel like that's where the human experience really tries to understand the world around it.
Yes. Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. And hopefully we can contribute just a little bit to that with Dark Ozarks.
Absolutely. With the understanding that we're not going to wrap this up neatly and tidily, and you know, explain it all away and say, oh, it was, you know, just it was just a weather balloon. Nothing to see here, folks. We all just go on about your lives. Put your blinders back on.
Right. Or nothing as simple as, you know, we just had a crazed killer and that's what created a situation or whatever.
Yeah.
Looking at these issues three-dimensionally.
Mm-hmm. And that's challenging. And you know, when you get into the issues like Billy Cook, when you get into these issues of individuals doing terrible things, it is so easy to transfer that sense into the other. That's that over there has nothing to do with me. There's no way I could go there. And when we do that, we start to lose the capacity to understand how that occurred, because then it's just a natural phenomenon. The serial killing, hitchhiking serial killer is just a phenomenon, like a bolt of lightning that you can't control, you can't have any impact on. And I think that's very short-sighted, because it's the reality that any one of us under certain circumstances might ultimately do terrible things. It's part of the human experience. It's part of the human story.
Exactly. And, you know, and so I hope that we get to contribute to that field of information, that there are no easy answers, and that's what makes us more human too.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And hopefully not, you know, moving to a point that we begin to repeat fewer of our mistakes.
Exactly. Hopefully.
Yes. Fingers crossed. And we need it. Oh, good times.
Yes, it is. And so everybody, I think we'll be back here Friday evening at 7:00. And if you have topics or stories from the archives of the Dark Ozarks that you want to talk about, let us know and we will include them. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a good week.
Absolutely. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.